All right, let's talk about which Linux version we want to be using. Now, let's talk a little bit first about the history of Linux. The Unix operating system was released by Ken Thompson and Dennis Ritchie of AT&T back in 1970. This became a very popular operating system. Unix was rewritten in C and made it portable to a variety of different hardware vendors. And one of the things that you need to understand about Unix is it was largely used, and it was called an open system because it was able to run on a variety of different hardware from different hardware vendors. So this was kind of a buzzword, but Unix was very much licensed back then. In fact, 1977, Berkeley Software Distribution, or BSD, was developed, and it started being popular amongst universities, but AT&T sued Berkeley, and they had to limit that. So there's a lot of restrictions around initially the BSD. Now, since then, of course, we have free BSD, but that's a different story. What I'm trying to get you to understand is there was a lot of licensing. This is like long before we had the concept of open source software. All these enterprise companies like IBM and HP and AT&T, they're all very competitive in the Unix space. So when 1995 came along, Intel released the 386 chip. It was the first x86 microprocessor. And this is pretty revolutionary because this is a very affordable chip. And this is when we started seeing PCs show up on the marketplace. But commercial Unix was just too expensive. The companies maintaining Unix wanted too much money. So it wasn't suitable, even though it could have been run on x86 architecture or adapted to it. It was too expensive due to licensing costs. And that's how we got DOS. And ultimately, that led to Windows. And the rise of Microsoft was to provide software for the x86 architecture. It's simply because commercial Unix was just too expensive. There wasn't a Linux alternative. Then in 1987, Andrew Tannenbaum released Minix. This was a Unix-like system intended for academic use. The source code is available, but modification distribution was pretty restricted. They weren't able to tweak it, share it, and then redistribute it. That was prohibited. So that kind of limited its popularity amongst developers. And also, it was a 16-bit design, and it was not well suited for the 32-bit design of the Intel 386s, and these are becoming cheaper and more popular. Now, about this time, at the age of 21, Linus Torvalds released a project called FreeAxe, and this would later become Linux. He initially thought about naming it Linux, but he thought that was just a little too egotistical. So in 1992, this is a really pivotal move here by Torvalds. He released the Linux kernel under the GNU General Public License. Now, initially, the term Linux only referred to the kernel, and this is the operating system kernel. It doesn't include the distribution as a whole, so it's not like a whole operating system. It was just the operating kernel. You didn't have a shell, you didn't have compilers, you didn't have editors, all the tools that you're going to be utilizing within the operating system. This was just basically to boot and give the other stuff something to run in, effectively. Around the same time, the Debian project started in 1993, and it was to create a whole distribution of all these tools, the compilers, editors, and whatnot, and this was called GNU Linux. Initially, it was going that way, and then later we dropped the GNU part, and now it's back to Linux, and it refers to the distribution as a whole. So initially, it was just the kernel, then it went to GNU Linux, and now it's back to just Linux. And then in 1996, just a little fun fact here, Torvalds released the initial mascot of Linux called Tux, and there he is on the screen there. Now let's get into some of the popular Linux distribution. And again, a distribution is the Linux kernel and all the tools around it. So Debian was one of the first, and this is a non-commercial entity. It's maintained by all volunteers. It's a community, kind of a democratic process, so they vote on what features they want to add in and what they want to remove. So it's all community driven. There's no company behind it. And there's several distributions. Linux Mint is very, very popular. And then Ubuntu, also popular, but this is maintained by a commercial company, Canonical, and I think they're out of Britain, if I remember right. Then another distribution that popped up well, just Red Hat Linux, and that has become today Fedora. Fedora is the community distribution. So again, it's similar to Debian, but it's also sponsored by Red Hat. So Red Hat does pay people to work on Fedora, but there's also community distributors in it. So it's not just Red Hat employees, so it is a community, but it is heavily sponsored by Red Hat. Now, the next, based on Fedora, is Red Hat Enterprise Linux. So this is commercially supported and officially supported by Red Hat. And the difference is Fedora can be a little more bleeding edge, maybe not as stable and tested as Red Hat. Red Hat Enterprise Linux is known for being rock solid. So a little bit different there. So Fedora is going to be bleeding edge technology, where Red Hat is going to be embed the enterprise type software on it. CentOS, or a lot of people say CentOS, I prefer saying CentOS myself, is the exact same thing as Red Hat, but with the terminology Red Hat removed, the exact same operating components. Now remember, Red Hat and Linux, it's all the GNU Linux components, so it's all open source software. And then Oracle Linux is also based on Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, Amazon Linux is a little bit different. It is based on Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but they do have some additional extensions in there, so it's not 100%, whereas CentOS is definitely 100%. I'm not 100% sure about Oracle Linux, but I think it is pretty close to 100% compatible with Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And then another very popular distribution is SUSE. SUSE Enterprise Linux is also, it's like Oracle and Red Hat, where it is commercially licensed and commercially supported. And then OpenSUSE is similar to Fedora, where it is a community edition, but it's also sponsored by SUSE. So OpenSUSE is very similar to Fedora. And then SUSE Linux Enterprise is effectively the SUSE version of Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Now, there's a lot of discussion and a lot of debate about which Linux distribution to use. Mint and Ubuntu are very, very popular with desktop users. And these editions are targeted towards desktop machines, where you're going to be focusing on things like compatibility with PC hardware and graphic cards and DVDs and different drivers for different hardware peripherals, where the server market is going to be focused on server-grade software. And right now, Red Hat Enterprise absolutely dominates the enterprise market. They have about 67% of the market share. SUSE is pretty popular. It's got a nice, strong foothold with a lot of financial institutions, and they have 12%. And then following up behind that is Oracle Linux with, I think it's, did I say SUSE has 20%? Oracle has 12% of the market. So between the two, Red Hat and Oracle, Fedora-derived Linux distributions have 79% of the market. Now, I recommend to use CentOS. That is my personal preference. Effectively, CentOS is Red Hat Enterprise Linux. And what Red Hat does is they put the term Red Hat into the source code and on the system. And Red Hat is a licensed trademark, and that's how they I'm using air quotes here, to license their product. So Red Hat, the official distribution of Red Hat Enterprise Linux, is a licensed product that you have to buy a license and support from Red Hat to use. CentOS is the exact same software with the phrases Red Hat scraped out of it effectively. So they're looking at the same versions. There's thousands, tens of thousands of programs and components compiled into a distribution, and they're all open source components. But what CentOS is a community that go in and strip out any references to Red Hat and release a distribution. So these distributions are compatible with Red Hat. And going forward in this course, you're going to see me using CentOS because it is most likely what you're going to see in companies. So while other distributions such as Ubuntu and Mint may be very, very popular and you might be using those at home, that's absolutely fantastic. I'm not bashing those at all. What I'm trying to do in this course is position you to see things that you're going to be using. And run-wise, performance-wise, they're pretty darn similar. What you're going to see is some differences in installers and command lines and how things are set up. So there are some nuances between the Linux operating systems, and I'm going to be showing you CentOS because that is most likely what you're going to see in the enterprise. So I want to prepare you for enterprise work throughout this course.